Greeting, dear listeners. Let me introduce myself. My name is Valentina Artyukhina, and I am an associate professor of Altai State University. A lecture on the topic Theoretical Foundation of Conflict Management is presented to your attention. Conflicts are natural and exist in all spheres of public life. Social knowledge does not consider conflict to be something good or bad. Any conflict has both constructive and negative consequences. In this regard, the main goal of conflict participants and mediators is to have more positive consequences and to have less negative ones. Conflict management is a kind of art, however, it is based on theoretical developments of contemporary social knowledge. Today, we will consider some theoretical aspects of conflict management. We will get acquainted with the main conflict elements, its causes and consequences. Find out what patterns exist in the conflict dynamic. We will consider the concept of conflict management, its principles and elements. I hope this lecture will be useful for you. I wish you effective work, and let's get started. To begin with, we note that conflict is an extremely difficult phenomenon to study. On the one hand, everyone understands what this term means, and on the other hand, there is no generally accepted definition of it in science. If we analyze the definitions of this term, we can find some features, aspects, facts by which we can determine the conflict presence. These include conflict characteristic features presented on the slide. Firstly, in any conflict, regardless of the type and magnitude, there are at least two participants. Secondly, as a rule, the conflict subject is a scarce resource. It can be both of a material nature and from the field of ideology, values, views. Thirdly, any conflict arises as a contradictions in the participants' goals. They cannot be realized at once and come into conflict. Fourthly, any conflict is a process that goes through certain stages and phases. It develops in time and is not static. Fourth, any conflict presents itself in a certain way, in the form of actions, words. Otherwise, we can say that the conflict is usually visible to others. Conflicts have always been in the field of interest of scientists, thinkers, and philosophies. Conflict knowledge has gone through a long history, and now we can name some thoughts that are shared by most academic community representatives. Firstly, the conflict is inevitable and natural. It cannot be evaluated through the categories of good or bad. Secondly, conflict is a process. It has stages, phases. During this process, the opposition of at least two sides is realized. Thirdly, there are patterns of conflict occurrence, development, and resolution. The outcome of the conflict depends on some variables: severity, duration, strength. Fourthly, any conflict has positive and negative consequences. The former contribute to the social system unity, and the latter can lead to its destruction. In the fifth, there are no single-cause conflicts. Any conflict has a complex of subjective and objective causes. As already mentioned, there is no conflict that occurred for one cause. Any conflict is based on a complex of objective and subjective causes. Very conditionally, these causes can be divided into four groups: objective, organizational and managerial, social-psychological, and personal. Let's characterize each group in more detail. The first two groups of factors are mainly objective. The third and fourth are mainly subjective. The objective conflict causes include mainly those circumstances of social interaction that led to a clash of people's interests, opinions, attitudes. Objective reasons lead to the latent conflict emergence. For example, in an organization, the position of the department head is vacated, for which several employees can apply. Since there is one position and there are several applicants, their interests objectively, regardless of the employee's desire, collide. Such a collision may or may not lead to a conflict. However, if there was one applicant to this position, then there would be no clash of two or more employees' interests. In such a situation, the conflicts associated with the appointment to the vacant position would be excluded, since there would be no objective basis for it. The subjective conflict causes are mainly related to the opponent's individual psychological characteristics, which lead to the fact that they choose the conflict and not any other way to resolve the objective contradiction that has arisen. So, almost any conflict has a complex of objective-subjective causes. Here are some examples. Objective causes include natural collision or lack of significant material and spiritual people interests in the process of their life. The structural and organizational conflict causes consist in the inconsistency of the organization structure with the requirements of the activity it is engaged in. The more the organization structure does not meet the requirements of the activity it is engaged in, the less effective the function of the organization and the more interpersonal and intergroup conflicts arise in its teams. The socio-psychological ones include those conflict causes that are caused by the direct people interaction, the factor of their inclusion in social groups. One of these reasons is the possible significant loss and distortion of information in the process of interpersonal and intergroup communication. The personal conflict causes are primarily related to the individual psychological characteristics of its participants. They are caused by the specifics of the human psyche processes during its interaction with other people and the environment. Next, consider the conflict's consequences. They are usually divided into destructive and constructive. As a rule, the destructive conflict consequences are more obvious and therefore most often recorded in our minds. Let's characterize some of them. Firstly, most conflicts have a negative impact on the mental state of its participants. Secondly, poorly developing conflicts can be accompanied by psychological and physical violence. Statistics shows that the majority of premeditated murders are committed as a result of the conflict escalation. As a rule, inter-ethnic and interstate conflicts are accompanied by a huge number of victims. Also, conflict negatively affects the opponent's effectiveness. They pay less attention to the quality of their work. Among the constructive conflict functions in relation to the main participants, the following can be distinguished. The conflict eliminates, in whole or in part, the contradiction that arises in the human interaction process. The conflicts allow a deeper assessment of the human individual psychological characteristics involved in it. The conflict tests a person's value orientations, the relative strength of his motives, reveals psychological resistance to the stressful factors. Also, conflict allows to reduce emotional tension, which is the reaction of participants to a conflict situation. Conflict interaction, especially accompanied by violent emotional reactions, in addition to possible negative consequences, relieves emotional tension in a person. Next, conflict dynamics. The following periods and stages can be distinguished in the conflict dynamics. Latent period, pre-conflict, includes stages. At first, The contradiction emerges between the subjects. Since the contradiction has not yet been realized and there are no conflict actions, this situation is called problematic. At second, the perception of reality of this problematic, the understanding of the need to take some action to resolve the contradiction is the meaning of this stage. At third, attempts by parties to resolve an objective problematic situation in non-conflict ways. Persuasion, explanation, requests informing the opposing party. Discovery period or conflict interaction or actual conflict. Incident. The first clash of the parties, a test of strength, an attempt to solve a problem by force in their favor. Escalation. The development of the conflict processing over time, the aggravation of the confrontation in which the subsequent destructive effects of the opponents on each other are higher in intensity than the previous ones. Balance counteraction. The parties continue to oppose, but the intensity of the struggle is decreasing. The parties are aware that the continuation of the conflict by force does not give results, but action to reach an agreement have not yet been taken. The conflict end consists in the transition from conflict interaction to finding a solution to the problem and ending the conflict for any reason. Post-conflict period. Partial normalization of relations. The resurrection of self-esteem, the level of claims, the attitude towards the partner. The feeling of guilt for their actions in the conflict is aggraved. Negative attitudes towards each other do not make it possible to normalize relations in full. Full normalization of relations occurs when the parties realize the importance of further constructive interaction. Conflicts arise in almost all spheres of human activity in the process of their interaction and are the natural state of any society. Competence in conflict resolution is the key to success in effective management. To manage a conflict means to be able to influence it in the right direction, to achieve correction of the conflict confrontation subject behavior. The end result can be not only the conflict resolution, but also a manifestation of the conflict positive functions, the successful implementation of business goals. Conflict management is an activity carried out all stages of conflict dynamics: pre-conflict, conflict interaction, post-conflict. In the end, it is important to achieve the cessation of all warring parties' actions, constructive conflict resolution. Consider the generally accepted conflict management principles. The first of them is objectivity. Correct appraisal of the situation and the conflict realistic perception. Objectivity of understanding is the necessary condition for conflict management and, at the same time, a methodological problem. Conflict manager has as an object not directly a real conflict, but its description, image, mental reflection, verbal interpretation. Each side strives to present the conflict as it sees inform its positions, as it understands the current situation, in other words, as it is interested in explaining the conflict. The second principle is concrete situational approach. It is impossible to fit all conflicts under one universal scheme. Socio-class conflicts, for example, have their own genesis and methods of resolution. National conflicts have their own dynamics and methods of overcoming. Military conflicts are decidedly different from all peaceful forms of confrontation. The third conflict management principle is publicity. The necessary information is brought to the attention of interested parties. Any attempt to hide the conflict existence in society or in the collective leads only to a deepening of confrontation, and, on the contrary, Timely and correct disclosure of the conflict, its causes and conditions, mean the creation of favorable presequences for its successful overcoming. Democratic influence on the conflict subjects is another conflict management principle. The democracy mechanism, each of its elements, serves as a reliable tool for managing social processes in the interests of the population majority. The fifth conflict management principle is consistency. It is supposed to influence the development of contradictions and the search for ways of interaction. Each principle is an integral part of conflict resolution. Their use is necessary for the effective management of such processes. The slide presents the main elements of the conflict management system. Conflict symptoms examination. This is an activity for the timely identification of an emerging conflict signs symptoms in order to take measures to prevent it. Conflict diagnosis assumes the definition of the conflict essence and features on the basis of its research, as well as a set of principles, techniques, and methods for studying the conflict. Conflict prediction. This is the development of reasonable assumptions about the possible future occurrence and development of a conflict. It is based on special scientific research. Conflict prevention is a type of management activity in relation to a conflict which consists in the early elimination of vacuum of conflict causes factors. It consists in such an organization of the subjects of social interaction vital activity, the creation of such conditions for the people activity and interaction that would minimize the likelihood of the emergence or destructive development of contradictions between them. Easing the conflict is the controlling influence on the conflict, which consists in the transition from escalation to the search of possible solutions. It is carried out at the stage of conflict interaction and creates presequences for conflict resolution. Conflict settlement is the process of ending a conflict in which a third party takes part in the resolution of contradiction. Conflict resolution is one of the forms of ending the conflict, a set of the conflict parties' positive actions, ending the confrontation by peaceful or forceful means and solving the problem that led to the conflict.